The midnight call that changed everything. The phone rang at exactly 11:47 p.m. in President Mahamat Idris Déby's private residence in N'Djamena, Chad's capital. The caller ID showed an encrypted number that only a handful of people in West Africa possessed. Déby knew immediately this wasn't a social call. On the other end of the line was General Abdourahmane Tiani, Niger's military leader who had recently taken control of the country through a coup. His voice carried the weight of desperation mixed with determination. The conversation that followed would set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the geopolitical landscape of the Sahel region within 48 hours. "My friend," Tiani began, his French accent heavy with fatigue, "we need to talk. Not tomorrow, not next week. Tonight." Déby had been expecting this call for weeks. Ever since Niger's military seized power in July 2023, removing President Mohamed Bazoum, the international community had imposed severe sanctions. France had cut military cooperation, the European Union froze financial aid, and ECOWAS, the regional economic bloc, threatened military intervention. Niger was isolated, struggling, and running out of options. But Chad, despite being Niger's neighbor and sharing similar challenges with terrorism and economic instability, had remained notably quiet about the coup. This silence wasn't accidental. Déby had been watching, waiting, and calculating. He understood something that many international observers missed. Sometimes the most powerful moves in geopolitics happen in the shadows, away from cameras and official statements. "What do you need?" Déby asked, already knowing the answer, but wanting to hear it directly. Tiani Quote's response was immediate. Security guarantees, economic lifelines, and most importantly, political legitimacy. "We both know that what happens in Niger affects Chad. The terrorists don't recognize borders, and neither should our response to them." The conversation continued for over 2 hours. Both leaders discussed the reality of their situation. The Sahel region had become a hotbed of terrorist activity. Groups like Boko Haram, ISIS in the Greater Sahara, and various al-Qaeda affiliates moved freely across borders. Traditional international partners had proven unreliable. France, once the region's security guarantor, was reducing its presence. The United States was focused elsewhere. Russia was offering military contractors, but at a steep political price. What emerged from this late-night conversation was a realization that both countries needed each other more than they needed the approval of distant capitals. Niger possessed significant uranium deposits and strategic geographic position. Chad had oil resources and relative political stability. Together, they could create a partnership that served their immediate security needs while positioning them for long-term economic growth. "We have 48 hours to make this work," Tiani said as the conversation wound down. "ECOWAS is meeting Thursday to finalize their intervention plans. If we're going to act, it has to be now." Déby agreed. He had been in power long enough to understand that timing in international relations was everything. Wait too long and opportunities disappear. Act too quickly, and you make mistakes that haunt you for years. But sometimes there comes a moment when bold action is the only rational choice. As soon as the call ended, both leaders began mobilizing their most trusted advisors. In Chad, Déby called his foreign minister, defense minister, and head of intelligence services to an emergency meeting at his residence. The agenda was simple but explosive. How to support Niger without triggering international backlash while securing Chad's own interests. Meanwhile, in Niger, Tiani was having similar conversations with his military council. The challenge they faced was immense. They needed to demonstrate that their government was legitimate and capable of governing, but they were running out of time and resources to prove it. The next morning brought troubling news from multiple sources. French satellites had detected unusual military movements near Chad's border with Niger. ECOWAS was accelerating its timeline for potential intervention. International media was reporting rumors of secret negotiations between the two countries. But perhaps most concerning was intelligence from both countries' security services, indicating that terrorist groups were planning to exploit any chaos that might result from an ECOWAS intervention. They had learned from similar situations in Mali and Burkina Faso that political instability created opportunities for extremist expansion. This intelligence added urgency to an already time-sensitive situation. Both Déby and Chiani realized that their country's security was interconnected in ways that went beyond simple neighborly cooperation. The terrorist threat demanded coordinated response, but coordination required political alignment that the international community seemed determined to prevent. By midday, both leaders had made a decision that would surprise their international partners and potentially reshape regional dynamics. They would meet secretly that very evening at a location known only to their most trusted advisors. The meeting would be disguised as a routine border security consultation, but its real purpose was far more ambitious. The location chosen was a small military outpost on the border between the two countries, a place that had been used for decades to coordinate anti-smuggling operations. It was remote enough to avoid international attention, but secure enough to allow for frank discussions between two leaders who were about to make decisions that would affect millions of people. As evening approached, both leaders' convoys began their journeys toward this remote meeting point. Each carried with them proposals, maps, financial projections, and security assessments that would form the basis of their negotiations. But more importantly, each carried the weight of their country's futures and the recognition that traditional approaches to regional security and development had failed. The stage was set for a meeting that would either mark the beginning of a new chapter in Sahel cooperation or demonstrate the limits of what two determined leaders could accomplish in an increasingly complex international environment. What neither leader fully understood yet was how dramatically their 48-hour gamble would change not just their country's relationship, but the entire regional balance of power in West Africa. As their convoys approached the meeting point under cover of darkness, both Déby and Chiani knew there was no turning back. The border meeting that shocked diplomats. The military outpost at Kuri Bugudi had seen many clandestine meetings over the years, but nothing quite like what was about to unfold on this humid Tuesday evening. Located exactly on the border between Chad and Niger, the small compound consisted of just 4 buildings surrounded by razor wire and watched over by a handful of soldiers from both countries. President Déby's convoy arrived first, consisting of 3 armored vehicles and a communications truck. His security detail immediately established a perimeter, while technical specialists began setting up encryption equipment that would prevent any electronic surveillance of the meeting. The preparations were meticulous, reflecting the sensitive nature of what was about to be discussed. 15 minutes later, General Chiani's convoy approached from the Niger side. Unlike Déby's official presidential motorcade, Chiani traveled in unmarked military vehicles, a reminder that his authority came from military power rather than electoral mandate. The contrast was symbolic of the different positions the two leaders occupied, yet both understood they needed what the other could offer. The meeting began in a small concrete room lit by battery-powered lamps. No official records would be kept, no photographs taken, no press releases issued. What happened in this room over the next 6 hours would remain secret for months, only becoming public when its effects were already reshaping regional politics. Déby opened the discussion with characteristic directness. The international community expects Chad to support sanctions against Niger and eventually participate in military intervention. But I didn't become president to serve foreign interests at the expense of regional stability. Chiani nodded, appreciating the candor. He had prepared for this moment for weeks, knowing that Chad's position would be crucial to Niger's survival as an independent state. "What do you need from us to make this work?" he asked. The negotiation that followed was unlike typical diplomatic exchanges. Both men understood they were operating outside normal channels, making commitments that their traditional allies would view as betrayals. But they also recognized that normal channels had failed to address the region's core challenges. Déby's first demand was comprehensive: intelligence sharing on terrorist movements, coordination of military operations along their shared border, and access to Niger's uranium reserves at preferential rates. In exchange, Chad would provide Niger with fuel supplies, oppose any ECOWAS military intervention, and use its diplomatic relationships to advocate for Niger's position internationally. But, as the discussion continued, it became clear that both leaders were thinking beyond immediate crisis management. They began sketching out a vision for long-term cooperation that would make their countries less dependent on external powers and more capable of addressing regional challenges independently. "Look at Mali," Chiani said, pointing to a map spread across the table. France withdrew, the UN mission ended, and what happened? More instability, not less. The same pattern in Burkina Faso. The international community promises security and development, but when conflicts intensify, they leave. Déby had lived through similar experiences. Chad had hosted French military bases for decades, received billions in development aid, and participated in numerous international peacekeeping missions. Yet terrorism continued to spread. Economic development remained elusive, and political stability required constant vigilance. "We need to create our own security framework," Déby replied. "Something that serves our interests first, not the interests of capitals thousands of miles away." The conversation then shifted to specifics. Both countries faced similar terrorist threats, but their military capabilities were complementary. Chad had a more experienced and better equipped army, while Niger had extensive knowledge of desert warfare and border control. Combining these strengths could create a formidable counterterrorism capability. More importantly, both countries possessed natural resources that, if properly coordinated, could reduce their dependence on international aid and foreign investment. Niger's uranium was essential for nuclear power generation worldwide. Chad's oil reserves could provide energy security for both countries. By coordinating their resource development and marketing, they could negotiate from a position of strength, rather than desperation. The economic dimension of their discussion was particularly revealing. Both leaders had watched as international sanctions devastated their neighbors' economies without producing the political changes that sanctions were supposed to encourage. Instead, sanctions often strengthened authoritarian tendencies while impoverishing ordinary citizens. "Sanctions only work if the target has no alternatives," Déby observed. "But what if we create alternatives for each other?" This insight led to the most ambitious part of their agreement. They would establish joint ventures in resource extraction, create shared transportation networks, coordinate their banking systems, to facilitate trade, and develop mutual defense agreements that would make any external military intervention extremely costly. But perhaps most significantly, they agreed to challenge the assumption that regional African problems required international solutions. Their partnership would demonstrate that African countries could address their own security and development challenges if they worked together effectively. As midnight approached, both leaders had to address the elephant in the room: international reaction. Chad was a significant recipient of international aid and maintained important relationships with France, the United States, and regional organizations. Niger's military government was already isolated and facing the threat of intervention. International community will accuse us of undermining democracy and regional stability," Chiani acknowledged. "How do we handle that pressure?" Déby's response reflected his years of experience navigating international politics. "We don't apologize for protecting our country's interests. We explain our position clearly, demonstrate results, and force them to engage with the reality we create, rather than the reality they prefer." The final hours of the meeting focused on implementation. Both leaders understood that their agreement would only be meaningful if they could execute it quickly and effectively. They established secure communication channels, agreed on specific timelines for various initiatives, and identified trusted representatives who would coordinate implementation. Most crucially, they agreed on a public communication strategy. Rather than announcing their partnership immediately, they would begin implementing it quietly while maintaining public positions that wouldn't immediately alarm international partners. Only when their cooperation was producing clear results would they acknowledge its full scope. As dawn approached, both leaders felt they had accomplished something significant. They had created a framework for cooperation that addressed their immediate needs while positioning their countries for long-term independence. But they also understood that the real test would come in the next 36 hours, as they began implementing their agreement, while the world watched for any signs of what they had actually decided. The meeting concluded with a handshake and a mutual commitment that would soon shake the foundations of international relations in West Africa. Neither man could have predicted how quickly their secret partnership would become public knowledge, or how dramatically it would change the regional balance of power. The 24-hour countdown to crisis Wednesday morning brought an immediate test of the secret agreement forged just hours earlier. At 6:30 a.m., intelligence reports began flowing into both N'Djamena and Niamey, indicating that ECOWAS military planners had accelerated their timeline for intervention in Niger. What had been scheduled as a gradual buildup of pressure was now being fast-tracked into a potential military operation within 72 hours. The intelligence came from multiple sources that both countries had cultivated over years of regional cooperation. Satellite imagery showed unusual military movements in Nigeria, Benin, and Ivory Coast. Communications intercepts revealed logistics planning for a multinational force. Most concerning, French military advisors were being repositioned to facilitate potential air support for any intervention. President Déby received the briefing in his office at 7 a.m., surrounded by his defense minister, intelligence chief, and foreign minister. The mood was tense but focused. Everyone in the room understood that the partnership they had agreed to the night before was about to face its first major test much sooner than anticipated. "How much time do we have?" Déby asked his intelligence chief. "Based on logistics requirements and current military movements, any intervention would begin no earlier than Friday afternoon," came the reply. "But political pressure is building rapidly. The ECOWAS summit scheduled for Thursday has been moved up to this afternoon. They're going to make a final decision today." Meanwhile, in Niger, General Chiani was dealing with his own crisis management. His military council had been in emergency session since dawn, reviewing intelligence reports that painted an increasingly urgent picture. But unlike previous crises, Chiani now had something he hadn't possessed before: a committed regional partner. The first concrete test of the Chad-Niger agreement came at 9 a.m. when Chiani activated the secure communication channel established during their border meeting. His message to Déby was brief but loaded with significance. Implementation timeline moved to immediate. Request activation of agreed measures. Déby's response came within an hour, and it shocked even his own advisors. Chad would immediately begin fuel deliveries to Niger, deploy additional troops to their shared border under the pretext of anti-terrorism operations, and most significantly, Chad's foreign minister would fly to Abuja that afternoon to address the ECOWAS summit directly. The audacity of this move cannot be overstated. Chad was essentially inserting itself into the middle of a regional crisis, challenging the assumption that ECOWAS could make decisions about Niger without considering the broader regional implications. It was a diplomatic gamble that could either prevent a military intervention or make Chad a target of international pressure. But Déby had calculated that ECOWAS leaders, despite their public statements, were not eager for military confrontation. Many member states faced their own internal challenges and understood that military intervention in Niger could destabilize the entire region. If Chad could provide them with a face-saving alternative, they might be willing to take it. The afternoon ECOWAS summit in Abuja was unlike any in the organization's history. What was supposed to be a final decision on military intervention became a heated debate about regional sovereignty, external interference, and the limits of international law. Chad's foreign minister, arriving unannounced and uninvited, requested permission to address the assembly. His speech, delivered in fluent French and English, was a masterpiece of diplomatic maneuvering. Without explicitly defending Niger's military government, he argued that external military intervention would create more problems than it solved. He pointed to recent experiences in Mali and Burkina Faso, where international interventions had failed to restore stability or democracy. More importantly, he proposed an alternative: a Chad-mediated dialogue between Niger's military government and ECOWAS, with specific timelines for political transition and guarantees for regional security. Cooperation. It was a proposal that gave everyone something they needed while avoiding the costs and risks of military intervention. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Nigeria's president, under pressure from international partners to lead the intervention, argued that accepting Chad's proposal would legitimize military coups throughout the region. Senegal's leader supported dialogue but insisted on strict conditions for Niger's military government. But privately, many ECOWAS leaders were relieved to have an alternative to military action. The logistics of intervention were complex, the costs were high, and the risks of failure were significant. Chad's proposal offered a way to maintain regional credibility while avoiding potential disaster. As the summit continued, events were moving rapidly on the ground. The first Chadian fuel convoy crossed into Niger at 2 p.m., met by crowds of ordinary Nigerians who saw the delivery as a sign that their country wouldn't be abandoned by its neighbors. The symbolic impact was enormous, demonstrating that Niger had regional support despite international isolation. Simultaneously, Chadian military units began repositioning along the Niger border under the cover of routine anti-terrorism operations. These movements were carefully coordinated to avoid provoking ECOWAS, while sending a clear message that any military intervention in Niger would face complications. But the most significant development was happening behind the scenes. Throughout the day, both Déby and Chiani were working their contacts in regional capitals, explaining their position and building support for Chad's mediation proposal. They were particularly effective with leaders who had their own reasons to be skeptical of external pressure on sovereign governments. By evening, the ECOWAS summit had reached a deadlock. Military intervention remained on the table, but Chad's proposal had introduced enough uncertainty to prevent immediate action. More importantly, several member states had begun questioning whether intervention was really in their interests or primarily served the agenda of external powers. The turning point came during a private dinner meeting between Nigeria's president and Chad's foreign minister. The conversation, witnessed only by their closest advisors, would later be described as one of the most frank discussions of regional politics in years. "What are you really asking for?" Nigeria's president asked directly. "Time," the Chadian minister replied. "Time to prove that African solutions to African problems can work better than external interventions." The honesty of this exchange broke through diplomatic pretense and addressed the real issue at stake. This wasn't just about Niger's government or democratic principles. It was about whether African countries would solve their problems through their own institutions or continue to rely on external powers that had their own agendas. As Wednesday evening approached, both Chad and Niger had succeeded in their immediate objective, preventing an immediate military intervention. But they had also raised the stakes considerably. The international community was now watching their partnership closely, and any failure to deliver on their promises would have severe consequences. The next 24 hours would determine whether their bold gamble would transform regional politics or lead to their diplomatic isolation. With ECOWAS postponing its final decision until Friday, both leaders knew they had bought time. But time that would be meaningless unless they could use it to demonstrate real progress. The countdown to crisis had become a countdown to opportunity. But success would require flawless execution of plans that had never been tested under such intense international scrutiny. The domino effect begins. Thursday morning revealed the true scope of what Chad and Niger had set in motion. Intelligence agencies across 3 continents were scrambling to understand the implications of Chad's sudden diplomatic intervention at the ECOWAS summit. What had appeared to be a simple crisis management effort was beginning to look like something far more strategic and far-reaching. The first sign that the situation had evolved beyond a bilateral agreement came at 8 a.m. when Burkina Faso's military government issued an unexpected statement. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who had led his own coup in 2022, announced that Burkina Faso would support any peaceful resolution to the Niger crisis that respects sovereignty and promotes regional stability. This wasn't just diplomatic courtesy. Burkina Faso was signaling that the Chad-Niger partnership resonated with other military governments in the region. Within hours, Mali's military leadership issued a similar statement, and even Guinea's military government expressed support for dialogue over intervention. What was emerging was not just a bilateral partnership between Chad and Niger, but the foundation of a new regional bloc that challenged the traditional assumptions about how West African politics should work. Countries that had been internationally isolated were finding each other and discovering that their combined resources and strategic positions gave them significant leverage. President Deby understood immediately that the dynamic had shifted, far beyond what he and Chiani had originally envisioned. Their secret meeting had catalyzed something larger, a realignment of regional power that could either stabilize the Sahel or fragment ECOWAS entirely. At 10 a.m., Deby convened an emergency meeting of Chad's National Security Council. The agenda was simple but profound. Should Chad embrace its role as the leader of this emerging bloc, or should it step back and focus on its bilateral relationship with Niger? We started this to solve a specific problem, his foreign minister observed. Now we're being asked to lead a regional revolution. That's a much bigger responsibility and a much bigger risk. But Deby's intelligence chief presented a different perspective. The old system was already breaking down. Military governments in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea were isolated and vulnerable. Now they see a path to legitimacy and cooperation. We can either lead this process or watch it happen without us. The decision Deby faced was complicated by pressure from multiple directions. France's ambassador had requested an urgent meeting to discuss Chad's concerning departure from regional consensus. The United States Embassy was asking for clarification of Chad's position on democracy and good governance. Even the African Union was expressing concern about the precedent Chad was setting. But there was also pressure from the opposite direction. By noon, Deby had received calls from the leaders of Burkina Faso and Mali, both asking if Chad would be willing to expand its mediation role beyond Niger to include broader questions of regional security and economic cooperation. The turning point came during a secure video call between Deby and Chiani at 1 p.m. Both leaders had been monitoring the regional reaction to their partnership, and both understood that they had unleashed forces beyond their original control. We have a choice, Chiani said. We can try to contain this to our bilateral relationship, or we can accept that we've started something bigger and take responsibility for leading it. Deby's response would reshape the political landscape of West Africa. If we're going to do this, we do it properly. No half measures, no apologies. Within 2 hours, Chad had issued invitations for an emergency summit of Sahel states to be held in N'Djamena the following Monday. The invitation list was carefully crafted to include not just military governments, but also civilian leaders, who had expressed frustration with traditional approaches to regional security and development. The announcement of the N'Djamena summit sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles in Paris, London, Washington, and Brussels. Western governments had spent years trying to maintain influence in the Sahel through a combination of military cooperation, development aid, and diplomatic pressure. The prospect of a coordinated Sahel bloc that could negotiate independently was a strategic nightmare. But the reaction from African capitals was more nuanced. While ECOWAS leaders publicly expressed concern about the summit, privately many were intrigued by the possibility of a regional approach that wasn't dependent on external validation or support. The most dramatic response came from France, which had based its entire Sahel strategy on bilateral relationships with individual countries. The French Foreign Ministry issued a statement expressing deep concern about initiatives that could undermine regional stability and democratic progress. Behind the scenes, French officials were working frantically to prevent the summit from taking place. The pressure on Chad intensified throughout the afternoon. The European Union threatened to review its development aid to Chad. The World Bank postponed consideration of new loans. International media began portraying Chad as abandoning its democratic commitments and destabilizing the region. But Deby had anticipated this pressure and had prepared for it. At 4 p.m., he held a press conference that was broadcast live across the region. His message was clear and unapologetic. Chad was not abandoning democracy or international cooperation, but it was prioritizing African solutions to African problems. For too long, Our region has been told how to solve its problems by people who don't live with the consequences of those solutions, Davies said. We have tried external interventions, international peacekeeping missions, and foreign-designed development programs. The result has been more instability, not less. The press conference was a masterclass in political communication. Deby didn't attack international partners directly, but he questioned the effectiveness of their approaches. He didn't defend military coups, but he argued that external pressure often made political transitions more difficult, not easier. Most importantly, he framed the emerging Sahel partnership as a natural evolution of African integration, not as a rejection of international cooperation. We want to work with the international community, he concluded, but as equal partners, not as dependents. The immediate reaction to Daby's press conference revealed the extent to which regional opinion was shifting. Social media across the Sahel exploded with support for Chad's position. Young people in particular embraced the message that African countries should solve their own problems. Even in countries with civilian governments, there was significant public sympathy for the idea of regional independence from external interference. But the most significant reaction came from an unexpected source. Nigeria's president, who had been the strongest advocate for military intervention in Niger, issued a statement calling for careful consideration of all peaceful alternatives before resorting to military action. This shift by Nigeria's leadership was crucial because it indicated that even ECOWAS's most powerful member was beginning to question the wisdom of intervention. If Nigeria was having second thoughts, it would be extremely difficult for ECOWAS to proceed with military action. As Thursday evening approached, it was clear that the secret deal between Chad and Niger had evolved into something neither leader had originally envisioned. They had not simply created a bilateral partnership. They had catalyzed a regional realignment that was challenging fundamental assumptions about power, sovereignty, and cooperation in West Africa. The question now was whether they could manage the forces they had unleashed. The next 24 hours would determine whether their bold initiative would lead to a new era of African cooperation, or whether it would fragment the region and isolate their countries from the international community. With the N'Djamena summit just 4 days away and ECO was still threatening military intervention, both leaders understood that they had passed the point of no return. Success would require not just diplomatic skill, but the ability to demonstrate that their vision of regional cooperation could actually deliver the security and development that traditional approaches had failed to provide. The point of no return Friday morning brought news that changed everything. At 6 a.m., intelligence reports confirmed what both Deby and Chiani had been dreading. A massive terrorist attack was being planned to coincide with any ECOWAS military intervention in Niger. The attack would target civilian infrastructure across multiple countries, designed to demonstrate that external military action would only increase regional instability. The intelligence came from sources both leaders had developed independently over years of counterterrorism cooperation. Cell phone intercepts, satellite imagery, and human intelligence all pointed to the same conclusion. Terrorist groups saw the Niger crisis as an opportunity to expand their operations, while international attention was focused on political rather than security issues. This development transformed the entire dynamic of the regional crisis. What had been a debate about democracy and sovereignty suddenly became a matter of immediate security for millions of people. Both leaders understood that they now had information that could either justify their partnership or destroy it, depending on how they used it. Deby's first instinct was to share the intelligence immediately with ECOWAS and international partners, but his security advisors warned that doing so could compromise their sources and potentially make the terrorist threat worse. More importantly, they argued that the intelligence actually validated the core argument Deby and Chiani had been making, that external intervention would destabilize the region rather than stabilize it. The dilemma was profound. If they shared the intelligence and it prevented the planned attacks, they would be seen as responsible partners in regional security. But if they withheld it and attacks occurred during or after an intervention, they would be blamed for allowing preventable violence. At 8 a.m., Deby made one of the most difficult decisions of his presidency. He would share the intelligence, but only with a select group of regional leaders. and only in the context of a proposal for immediate regional security cooperation that would make external intervention unnecessary. The secure communications that followed over the next 2 hours were unlike anything in the history of West African diplomacy. Deby personally called the presidents of Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, and Ivory Coast, sharing intelligence details that demonstrated the immediate threat posed by any military action in Niger. The response was swift and dramatic. Nigeria's president, who had been the strongest advocate for intervention, immediately called an emergency session of ECOWAS security chiefs. Ghana's leader, who had been skeptical of Chad's mediation efforts, requested an immediate conference call with Deby to discuss regional security coordination. But the most significant response came from France, whose intelligence services quickly confirmed Chad's assessment of the terrorist threat. French officials who had been pressuring for strong action against Niger's military government suddenly found themselves facing a security situation that made political pressure seem secondary. At 11 a.m., General Chiani received a call that surprised even him. Nigeria's president was personally requesting a direct conversation about immediate security cooperation, bypassing both ECOWAS and Niger's international isolation. The conversation that followed was historic. For the first time since Niger's coup, the leader of ECOWAS's most powerful member was speaking directly with Niger's military leader, not to deliver ultimatums, but to discuss practical cooperation against shared threats. "We can argue about politics later," Nigeria's president said. "Right now we have a security crisis that threatens all of us. What do you need to help prevent these attacks?" Chiani's response was carefully prepared. Niger's military had extensive knowledge of terrorist networks and border infiltration routes, but they needed intelligence sharing, logistical support, and coordinated operations with neighboring countries. Most importantly, they needed assurance that their cooperation wouldn't be used against them politically. Within hours, an unprecedented level of security cooperation was emerging across the region. Chad's intelligence services were sharing real-time information with counterparts in Nigeria, Mali, and Burkina Faso. Niger's border control units were coordinating directly with their neighbors. Even France's remaining military assets in the region were being integrated into a collaborative response. But this security cooperation was happening entirely outside formal ECOWAS structures, creating a new reality that challenged traditional assumptions about regional governance. Countries that had been political adversaries were working together against shared threats, demonstrating that security cooperation could transcend political disagreements. The afternoon brought another surprise. At 3 p.m., Chad announced that it had successfully disrupted a terrorist cell planning attacks in 3 countries. The operation, conducted jointly with intelligence services from Niger and Nigeria, had prevented what could have been one of the largest terrorist operations in the region's history. The announcement was accompanied by a joint statement from Chad, Niger, and Nigeria calling for expanded security cooperation, based on practical results rather than political rhetoric. The statement didn't resolve the political crisis around Niger's government, but it demonstrated that regional security could be maintained through African cooperation. The international reaction to this development was complex and conflicted. Western governments were relieved that major terrorist attacks had been prevented, but concerned that the success came through cooperation with Niger's military government rather than through isolation and pressure. ECO found itself in a particularly difficult position. The organization had threatened military intervention partly on the grounds that Niger's instability threatened regional security. But now Niger was demonstrating that it could contribute positively to regional security, even under military government. The most dramatic shift came from France, which had based its entire Sahel strategy on the assumption that cooperation with military governments legitimized authoritarian rule. Faced with evidence that such cooperation could prevent massive loss of life, French officials began quietly reconsidering their approach. By evening, it was clear that the secret partnership between Chad and Niger had achieved something unexpected. It had created a practical demonstration that regional African cooperation could address security challenges more effectively than external intervention or international isolation. But success brought new challenges. International media was beginning to report on the extent of Chad-Niger cooperation, making it impossible to maintain the fiction that their partnership was limited to border security. More importantly, the success of their joint operations was attracting attention from other African countries that wanted to participate in similar cooperation. At 8 p.m., Deby and Chiani held their final secure conversation before their partnership became public knowledge. Both leaders understood that they had crossed a line from crisis management to regional leadership, with all the responsibilities and risks that such leadership entailed. "We started this to solve an immediate problem," Chiani observed. "Now, we're being asked to provide an alternative model for how African countries can work together. Are we ready for that?" Deby's response reflected both confidence and caution. "We've proven that it can work. Now we have to prove that it can be sustained." The next 48 hours would determine whether their bold experiment in regional cooperation would become a new model for African integration, or whether it would collapse under the weight of international pressure and internal contradictions. But one thing was certain: the secret deal between Chad and Niger had already changed the political landscape of West Africa in ways that could never be undone.